We have four accounts of this short sign in the four Gospels. Each author offers what the sign actually says. Now, I will put here on the screen the four versions of what the sign actually says. And you can see here that Matthew says, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Mark says that the sign says the King of the Jews. Luke says the sign says this is the King of the Jews. And John says that the sign reads, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, you've got four variations here of this sign. And you think to yourself, really? It's not a lot of words. And it seems to be important enough for each person to record. And this is a great example of variations we see between accounts that people will point to and say, wow, there you go. Good example. How could you trust when you got this level of variation? I mean, we got some of these have 5 words, some of these have 10 words. That's twice as many words. You could look at, if you start looking percentages of error between these signs, you could actually make the numbers look pretty bad in terms of how these signs compare. Well, let's talk about, though, the principles that we use when we work cold cases and see if we can apply some of these to this issue of these 4 allegedly contradictory signs. The first thing I do when I'm comparing accounts from 30 years ago is I look for the common details, those areas where every witness agrees. Because what happens is some elements of the scene, some elements of the crime are so dramatic that no matter who's watching it, everyone vectors in, and all the distractions, whatever it is you're interested in, whatever you were doing in that liquor store prior to the robbery occurring, as soon as that robbery started, as soon as the shots were fired, as soon as the demands were being made, as soon as people started screaming, everyone's attention vectors in, and suddenly the accounts become very specific because not every memory is equal. And so what product you were looking at a minute prior to the robbery, people won't always remember that. But when it comes down to what they saw at the point of the robbery, you start to see the commonalities emerge because that memory is more important and it was more pointed. You remember the nature of the crime was so dramatic, it causes you to remember it. So what I'm always looking for when comparing allegedly or apparently divergent accounts, and by the way, this is always the case in every case I've ever worked, I never get witnesses who agree. I'm looking to see what is it they do agree about, because it probably is important. That part is probably, when it's affirmed repeatedly, even though the edge details are somewhat different in every account, I know that this part is worthy of our attention. And here in this account, I'll put it on the screen, you can see that the one commonality in every one of these accounts is this thing, these 5 words, the King of the Jews. Now you might ask yourself, well, why is this one aspect of the account so important? Why is it so repeated? Well, I think a lot of that is because this is the actual crime that Jesus is being executed for. Now, we might say as Christians, we know that God's got a plan for the cross, and the whole reason why Jesus dies on a cross, we would say has an overarching transcendent purpose beyond the actual players here who arrested, convicted, and executed Jesus. There's a grander plan. We get that. But from the perspective on earth, we talked about perspective of the writer, the reason why Jesus is being executed is because he claimed to have the authority of the king. And for Caesar, there's even a point in Scripture where the Jews make a point of saying this. Pilate says, I can't find anything wrong with him. Oh yeah, but he has challenged the authority of Caesar. So this is the crime that Jesus is being accused of, and everyone focuses on this. And so I'm looking for that commonality that is so common when comparing eyewitness accounts. When I first saw this variation on the sign as a detective who was still an atheist, I read that and I said, yeah, that's about what I see all the time with eyewitness accounts. That's about the level of variation I expect to see when I've got reliable eyewitness accounts. That's the first principle. Look for what is in common. You want to identify the common details. Now, actually, as I'm talking about this today, I'm referring to an article I wrote this week on why there are 4 versions of the cross, of the sign over Jesus' cross. So you can actually go online and pick this up and download it as a PDF file. And along with this video, you can have a way to kind of train yourself how to deal with these contradictions. But let me go to the second point here. And that's that we want to be able to recognize the perspective of each eyewitness. That's really important. We talked about that before. It's about perspective. This is a perspective difference is not necessarily a difference in claim. We have different perspectives. When I say perspectives, I don't mean just geographically in the room. You were standing on that side of the aisle. I was standing on this side during the robbery. That's definitely one kind of perspective, but it's not just that. Each of us as eyewitnesses brings something into the crime, into the event, into the actual observation that is part of our nature, part of our personality, part of our interests, part of our life experience, and those things actually not color how we say it. That's not what I'm saying. They actually color how we see it. Here's what I mean by that. If you are, and I've mentioned this before as an example, because I have it so often, if I'm going to be in a crime scene and I want to know exactly what the suspect saw, I'm going to ask probably a woman, to be honest with you, because women are far more keyed in on clothing, and they'll tell you, a guy will say, I think he was wearing a t-shirt. Really? What color was it? I think blue. And the lady will say, oh, no, it was a Izod. It was a one button stopped right here. It had all kinds of detail. It had elastic at the sleeve. Really? Yeah, because everybody brings their own perspective and their own set of interests, which cause them to focus in minute detail on different aspects of the case. That is always the situation. So I don't expect to see anything differently from the authors of Scripture. As a matter of fact, I would look at what it is the authors of Scripture offer and get a clue as to what their interests are. Because again, all of us bring our interests into eyewitness observations. And we're going to focus on different things. This is not a contradiction. This is a difference in terms of focus. Now, how does this apply to the signs? Well, I think there's a clue that's offered in the Gospel of John. I want to read it to you. The Gospel of John says this, Then many of the Jews read this title, this is the sign over the cross, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. So here we have an example of Scripture and that is telling us that the sign is written in several different languages. And depending upon the perspective and the life experience and who you are as an author, you might pick one of those translations to focus on over another. And we don't know, for example, how precise each of those translations on the cross itself was to each other. We don't know if some were more detailed than others. So we don't know which of these is being reported by the eyewitnesses who are making the account made known either to Peter talking to Mark or whoever the authors, whoever Luke is talking to get his information, Matthew having been there, John having been there. We just don't know how much their own biography, their own perspective is playing into how they're reporting the sign. But it's something to consider. And I see it all the time in my own work. Third thing, you want to be able to consider the conditions of the interview, okay, or the interviewer. Now, I make this point because I've worked these kinds of cases over the years, a bunch of these, and you have to know up front the purpose of the interview, the purpose of who's saying this and why are they saying it. Give you an example of why I even say this. Mark's gospel is incredibly brief. Look at this. I'm going to put them on the wall again here for you. Look at the different versions of the cross signs. Which is the shortest? Mark's. It shouldn't surprise you. Mark's gospel is also incredibly brief. Now, why is that? I've worked with detectives who, when they write a supplemental report, it's like just the facts, ma'am. I mean, it's the shortest, briefest, just the bare minimum facts. I mean, I'm lucky if I can get any adjectives to describe anything from these reports from some of these guys. Well, why? Well, it turns out that's just the nature of that interviewer. That's just his own nature and why, and he brings that to his report. And unfortunately, if he dies and if the eyewitness dies, I'm not going to know if the eyewitness actually said it that way or if the detective just reported it that way. Why is Mark's gospel? It may just be that Mark's personality is such that it does seem like there's some evidence in Mark's gospel that he writes briefly with lots of dramatic energy. Maybe that's just who he is. Maybe he was working on a shorter papyrus, didn't have access to the materials he needed to write a long gospel. Who knows? We're never going to know that for sure. But we have to consider the perspective, the nature, the conditions of the interview, how it occurred in any interview I evaluate, and the nature of the interviewer, so I can know why something is written the way it is. And I bet that the brief nature of Mark's work in general may account for why his sign is also the briefest description. Another thing you want to consider is to differentiate between what is complementary and what is conflicting. Here's what I mean by that. Do we really think these four signs are conflicting in nature, or are they actually complementary? I'll put a sign up on the wall for you here. This is what I think is a reasonable version of the sign. If the sign actually said this is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, well, then you can see, and I'll list all below here, all that every single version that's reported actually affirms the content of that larger message. It may leave some things out, but all the versions then would be complementary to the larger sign that I posted on top. There's not a conflict here. These are actually all complementary versions of the larger sign. If that's first sign, now I'll show you what would be a conflict though. I don't see any of these being a conflict to the first sign. They're all complementary to the first sign. But if I saw this is Judas Iscariot, the King of the Jews, well, now this is very different. This cannot be reconciled to the larger sign. It's a difference in identity. Is it Jesus or Judas we're talking about here? Now, this would be a conflicting, contradictory account that would be really difficult for us to figure out how this could be so. But the other versions I offered to you, the versions we see in Scripture, are not conflicting. They're simply complementary. And you have to make a distinction between those two. Last thing we're going to talk about here today is it's really important for us, and as I make this point a lot, and I want to make sure that you guys get it because I think it's so important. There's a big difference. You want to be able to assess the opportunity for collusion when any eyewitnesses come together to report an event. Here's what I mean. Typically, when I am called out in the middle of the night, I make sure that I ask to have the witnesses separated. If you don't separate witnesses, you end up with people talking to each other and colluding, not colluding, but just getting their stories lined up. It can be very innocent, but I don't want that to happen. Do you honestly think if we had four Gospels that all said the exact same thing, that they would be under any less scrutiny, under any less criticism? Of course they wouldn't be, because you would think, well, gosh, these guys got together and got their story together. I want to see a certain level of variation between accounts, because then I know, especially get this, there's times when I am late to a crime scene and people have had the chance to talk. And if they've had the chance to talk, but then when I separate them and I ask them all their stories, there's still some apparent variation between these stories, I feel really good about it. Because even when they had the chance to line up their stories, they didn't. They saw it slightly differently, given their backgrounds, and they reported it that way. Well, here's what we have in Scripture. Folks who had the opportunity to line up their stories. You don't think that the gospel authors couldn't have done that, or the early church couldn't have done that, but they didn't. And that, to me, gives me great confidence that this variation is the natural kind of variation I would expect to see. Now, I've given you 4 or 5 principles there, and the 10 principles from the last speaking. I hope that these help you to work through the apparent, alleged contradictions of Scripture.